Hello, welcome to our talk exploring whether artificial intelligence is evaluation's friend or foe. I also want to give a special thank you to Brad for the invitation. He wrote a very lovely note to Sarah and I inviting us, so thank you for that. Okay, so the first thing to know is that despite a lot of recent news on generative AI, so stories about ChatGPT, Google Bard, Microsoft Copilot, AI has actually been around for a while. So, for example, how many of you use speech to text when you're writing text messages, right? Or how many of you use sentence autocomplete functions embedded in your email programs? Right? These all run on AI. So AI is not new to us, right? It's sort of been around for a while. What is new, however, is something called generative AI. And understanding the difference between non-generative and generative AI is really important. So to illustrate, non-generative machine learning models can be trained using millions of examples to predict whether certain X-rays show signs of a tumor. In fact, this is happening in medicine, right? So non-generative models make predictions based on data, right? That is how they function. That's how they work. Generative AI models, in contrast, learn patterns and structures from training data, and then they generate new objects that have similar characteristics. And there's all kinds of objects that they are generating at this point. So, for instance, they can generate things like text, they can generate things like images, they can generate videos, they can generate podcasts, right? There's a lot of objects that they can generate based on this. Sarah and I both immediately recognize that generative AI has implications for evaluation. And so early work that we did began with an online symposium. You see a flyer on your screen. Panel one focused on technology, methods, and training. Panel two on theory, practice, and business implications. And panel three on equity and ethics. The symposium was recorded. And so if you're interested, you can watch it online via the URL or a QR code on the screen. But what I will tell you is we had over 300 people register for that. This took place in March of 2023, which told us that our interest in AI and evaluation was shared by many in the community. I think those of you that have been at recent conferences this year see that, right? There were lots of sessions, both I was at EES and AEA, and there were a ton of sessions there on that, some of whom were done by folks on this call. Sarah and I were also planning to edit an NDE special issue on evaluation in AI while we were planning the symposium. And that's kind of one of the benefits of being editors in chief of a journal. So the issue was published in fall of 2023. You see a snapshot of the front here. It was and remains the first serious discussion of AI from multiple perspectives appearing in an evaluation journal. And this is also one of the unique things about NDE. Every issue is thematically focused, and so we could devote an entire issue to this. Here's a snapshot of the entire NDE issue. For the sake of time, I will tell you we will not be able to get into all the nuance that is in this special issue. But what I will say is the ideas that we're going to talk about today are based on what is included in the NDE issue. So if you want to learn a little bit more than what you hear here, you can go read that special issue. So as I've said, AI has implications for evaluation practice. And so I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who's going to start off our discussion for us.
So in planning this session, we broke this down into who is going to talk about the fun, exciting opportunities related to AI in evaluation, and then who is going to cover off on the doom and gloom and what are we all worried about. Bianca got doom and gloom. So my job for this first session is to talk us through the articles in the NDE issue that were exploring the question of what can AI offer for evaluation and for evaluators themselves. So there are, I think, 5 articles. I think we'll only have time to really talk through 3 in a little bit of depth, but I'll touch very briefly on the 4th and the 5th one. The first one of these focused on large language models and essentially makes the argument that through large language models, AI offers new tools that might make evaluation easier, more efficient, and help us to produce some new things that may not have been there before. But I know that large language models have been talked about a lot recently, but for those who may not be familiar, large language models use deep learning techniques and extremely large data sets to understand, summarize, generate, and predict new text. And so as Bianca was saying, that generation of new products is something that is new in terms of generative AI. This caught the public's attention in November of 2023 with ChatGPT, which was the first really public-facing and easy-to-use large language model. And so within this article, the authors make the case that over 2/3 of evaluation tasks will be affected by large language models in the next 5 years. Although there are risks associated with doing so, which Bianca gets the pleasure of being able to touch on. But some of the ways that they talk about potential application of large language models in the use of evaluation are things that you see on the screen here. So firstly, summarizing existing text. So this is using a large language model to condense large bodies of text, pull out points, summarize information from documents. So applied to evaluation, these could be useful for drafting executive summaries, drafting abstracts, anything along those lines. Another way that we can use large language models is in comparing multiple texts. So looking at ways that different texts are similar and different, also looking at some of the perspectives that are in them, so which ones are more optimistic, likely, or realistic, and then thinking about evaluation. This is something that could be applied to mixed methods approaches or triangulating different evidence sources. Probably one of the ways that I think a lot of people have been experimenting with is using large language models for analyzing individual texts. So this can be used for things like analyzing qualitative data sources. So uploading an interview transcript and then using a large language model or a tool based on a large language model to generate themes or generate a sentiment analysis based on its interpretation of the data. And so applied to the evaluation context, this is useful for data cleaning, for data analysis, and potentially even report writing or report drafting. So using that large language model to pull out key themes that could be placed into an evaluation report. It could also be used for analyzing tables and images, including in interpreting a table or image and then applying that to the generation of supporting narrative. So it could be, here is a table. What does this mean? Please provide a summary for me. So that would be useful during analysis and reporting. And then also for generating new text. So we might use a large language model to help us draft text for an introduction, for a conclusion section, or different components of an evaluation report. And so this is one of the images that's from the Head et al. Article, which I actually think is very, very helpful in thinking about ways AI might be used for evaluators. They have essentially mapped the different phases of evaluation from evaluation design through to reporting, and then have kind of connected all of the different ways that we might use large language models and how they apply to those different phases of evaluation. So we can use it to help us answer questions related to evaluation design, data collection, analysis, summarize data at the analysis phase, and use text-to-image generators, for example, at the reporting phase. So essentially, I will say upfront that the authors of this article do talk at length about potential limitations in doing so. That's Bianca's realm today, but essentially they are very optimistic about different ways that we might use large language models for the field of evaluation. That's our first article, our first version of fun. Our next article was written by Stefan Bonnie-Nielsen, and he explored, or conducted rather, an environmental scan to look at different perspectives on 2 questions. Question number 1 was, will emerging technologies affect evaluation as an industry? Question number 2 is, if so, how? Through his environmental scan, there was essentially a resounding yes. And in the article, he argues that essentially no profession or industry is going to be left unaffected by emerging technologies. And it's not a question of whether an industry will be affected, but rather how. And in the environmental scan, he essentially makes the argument that there are 5 plausible ways in which the profession will be affected, one of which is related to competitive strategies. So the way that evaluators compete for contracts, or the techniques that evaluators use to win bids and proposals. So recognizing that we are a service industry in many ways, there will be changes to the competitive strategies used there. There will be changes to the size and duration of contracts. So how much commissioners expect from a particular dollar amount, the timeframes in which they expect that work to be conducted, and the potential expectation that more might be done for less money and in less time, or something along those lines. What you see on the slide here is his summary of expectations in the way that it might change the nature of the evaluation services, so the tasks that actually get done. And so this table is an assessment of the degree to which evaluation tasks might be affected by emerging technologies. And I guess put another way, an assessment of the degree to which we might be able to utilize artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies in order to support evaluation activities and different evaluation tasks. The way that he approaches talking about evaluation service as a field is that we largely do three large buckets of things: monitoring and evaluation systems, evaluation studies, evaluation capacity building. The assessment based on that scan was that monitoring and evaluation systems have the largest potential to utilize emerging technologies. Evaluation capacity building has the least potential to utilize emerging technologies based on that scan, largely because there is less expectation for data processing or requirements for data processing, data storage, and management. But essentially concludes that emerging technologies will most likely displace and augment many of the human tasks that evaluators currently perform. This third article was one of my favorites from the issue. So what the team at Intention to Impact did was experimented with 3 different AI tools to assess their potential use within a small business. So their overall argument was that even though small businesses might feel like AI could threaten their jobs, there's a need for those small businesses to embrace AI tools in order to increase their value in the marketplace and to remain relevant. And so the 3 that you see on the screen here, Coloop, Avalanche, and Rayen, were the 3 tools that they experimented with. And in performing those experiments, what the team did was to essentially have both a human perform the task, then to have the AI tool to do the task, and then to do an analysis of the comparisons between what the human evaluator produced and what the AI tool was able to produce. Across the board, what they saw was that there was generally moderate to high alignment in the findings that emerged from both the human performing the task and the AI tool performing the task. There are some distinctions. So for example, in Avalanche, the AI tool was able to generate some more specificity in its findings as distinct from the evaluator, who was leading to kind of higher level findings. But across the board, there was a moderate to high degree of alignment. Just to finish up the last 2 very, very briefly, Silva Ferretti, I think, has a very creative approach to exploring how evaluators might use something like ChatGPT and categorizes different approaches that a human might take when generating a prompt for AI, depending on what it is that you want to get out of it. So for example, she then maps those to different evaluation activities and offers some potential prompts that an evaluator might use if, for example, they want to help develop a concept note, or if they want to assess their options in terms of evaluation designs, and or do something like simplifying text. So if you're interested in thinking about how might I use something like ChatGPT and what prompts could I use, the Ferretti article is a great place to go. And then the very, very last option was Tilton and Co., who looked at how might we use chatbots within the field of evaluation, and then what types of roles might those chatbots play. And so the very brief summary that you see on the screen here is that we might use chatbots for the role of a guidance counselor, for the role of a teaching assistant, and for the role of a mentor in supporting new and emerging evaluators. So that was a very brief summary of the 5 articles that talk us through how might AI be our friend as evaluators. I will hand it over to Bianca to start talking through how might AI be a foe to evaluators.
Great, thank you. Before doing so, just because others might be wondering this question, and I think it's helpful because there's a lot of new terms and a lot of new vocabulary we're learning in this space. And so one of the Michael Harner, who's on with us, asked, just checking, large language models are implementations of generative AI. So to clarify, large language models fall underneath the umbrella of generative AI, right? But the thing about them is right now, most of them are really about producing text. So they're text-based. So generative AI that it's text-based, right, are based on large language models. But as we know, generative AI produces other things other than text-based kinds of stuff. So they fall underneath that and are part of it. But yeah, so anyways, hopefully that answers your question and helps others on the call. Okay. So, as Sarah said, I get the doom and gloom portion of this. So what I'll say is there are some red flags and ethical issues to be aware of and to be thinking about. So I'm going to touch on some of the content that is in the articles in the NDE. So going back to Head and colleagues' article, they describe several potential red flags, two of which you see on the screen with some more information about them. So, as an example, it is well documented that AI can and does make up things. Now, some of this is getting better, right? Technology is improving, but we still are not where, we can fully trust it, right? Someone's sort of got to check it, got to verify it. We've got to have a human, looking at things. But the thing that I think is really particularly jarring, which is why we need a human to look at things, is because the level of sophistication that they're generating this stuff, even when it's made up, is really incredible, I will say, right? It sounds very confident. It sounds very credible, right? So, like, one of the examples that we heard really early on is it making up references that there's no, like, that reference doesn't exist, right? But it sounds really credible and it might be an APA format. So why would you doubt it, right? Those kinds of things, right? So we still have to be aware of that, right? It's getting better, but it's not there 100%. Bias too is a concern, and there are several different types of bias. Again, you see examples of this on the screen. And so, for example, historical bias has been shown to show up in AI tools and is often a reflection of the societal biases that are embedded in the training data sets that are used. So, for instance, if gender stereotypes are embedded in the training data sets that are used, all the examples of scientists are males and all the examples of teachers are females, for instance, right? That's then going to get amplified in whatever it produces, right? So we have to be thinking about this. This is why we can't just fully trust it yet. Language standard bias is another example that we have to think about. So, for example, if we are using a large language model, or an LLM for short, right? And if it's trained to respond based on a specific set of language standards and it leaves out other kinds of language standards, then that also just gets amplified. So, for instance, in English, right? If it's sort of, very proper US English, right? The kinds of things we learned in school about everything you should do and, all of that, right? But we also know that there are many dialects, right? So, for instance, there's African American vernacular English, right? If the training data sets don't have those dialects and other sort of vernaculars in there, then again there is a bias that's introduced that then gets amplified in anything it produces, right? Again, there's other kinds of biases. I'm not going to go into it, but I just wanted to give you a flavor for the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about, right, when we're thinking about this. Tarek Azam actually wrote a really interesting article that looked at AI and validity from a methodological sense, right? And so he, goes through a long discussion, but he had this really great table in his article, which you see on the screen, where he summarized the results of his work and, where he looked at the ability of evaluators versus AI to establish specific aspects or specific kinds of validity, right? And so one of his big takeaways was that AI actually does pretty well when we think about validity from a quantitative sense or a quantitative lens to this, right? But when we start to look at it from a qualitative perspective, right, meaning from data, those kinds of things, we're not quite there yet. And again, we know that this technology is expanding rapidly, but he definitely had some concerns there about, we need to make sure when we're using this if we're going to use it for qualitative analysis, we need to be really thoughtful because some of at least when he wrote the article, the technology wasn't there yet, right? Aileen Reed offers, I think, a really thoughtful set of ideas about how to center an equity lens in our work where we're using AI in our evaluation. And so she says right off the bat very clearly that her goal is not to cast AI in a bad light. It is to caution that as we as a field embrace AI in evaluation, that we do so through an equity lens. And she offers some reasons why she thinks that's particularly helpful. So, for instance, one of the things that she talks about is tools can be used for good or for bad, right? So, for example, fire hydrants are used in all kinds of very helpful ways. They're used to put out fires when a house is on fire. In the summertime, if you live in a hot area like cities, cities will sometimes turn on fire hydrants to cool down children, right? Or to cool down people in, particularly hot days. Those are all really good things. Fire hydrants have also been used to quell protest, right? Which we may not actually think is a good thing. And in fact, those of you who were around or learned about the civil rights protest in the 1960s know that there's plenty of photographic evidence that showed just how much fire hydrants were used to quell the civil rights protest in the 1960s. And so she wants to remind us that AI is another tool and it can be used for good or it can be used for bad. And that is part of our responsibility as evaluators to think about that. Another example she notes is that algorithms and AI, from her perspective, are not neutral. And she says this because she says behind every algorithm is a human being or several human beings with their own experiences, their own prejudices, their own biases, their own ways of seeing the world that influence consciously and unconsciously how the algorithms and AI are trained and then also then interact with us, right? And so, she wants us to sort of be aware of that, right? So one of the classic examples here is all the training that had to happen to train ChatGPT. And you can go read the news stories about the human coders who were helping to get that training data set, right, and that training model correct, and everything they had to go through. And many of them had to end up going through psychological, they were in counseling and seeing therapists because they had to look at things that they found that were particularly disturbing because they were trying to help tune the model and train the model. And so they had to look at a wide variety of things, right? So again, those are then getting amplified in then what gets used using those. So given that, it's not, it's a little bit yay and a little bit doom and gloom, right? But Sarah and I also want to offer a roadmap to the future and some ways for you all to think about it. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to start that discussion.
Thank you, Bianca. One of the ways that we have been thinking about how do we as a field support human evaluators to thrive in a world that has AI relates to evaluation competencies. And so our thinking here is to consider what evaluation competencies might be needed for an evaluator to thrive in an AI world. So there is an article in the e-issue that explores two different frameworks for thinking about how does AI influence or impact evaluation competencies. Max Tegmark, who is an AI researcher, offered this quote, which I enjoy quite a lot. It was a career advice for today's kids. Go into professions that machines are bad at, those involving people, unpredictability, and creativity. And so we also wanted to apply that to evaluation. So career advice for today's evaluators: go into those evaluation tasks that machines are bad at, those involving people, unpredictability, and creativity. In doing so, want to look at two different frameworks or frames for thinking about evaluation competencies. One of these is the landscape of human competencies. So the image that you see here is a recreated version of one that the same AI researcher, Max Tegmark, created, which was based on a conceptual idea put forward by a computer scientist named Hans Moravec. And the landscape of human competencies is a conceptual map that has hills and mountains at different elevations. It's made up of lowlands and highlands that represent different competencies based on how difficult those tasks are for a computer to perform. So in this version here, we have in the lowlands tasks that are very easy for computers to perform: arithmetic, rote memorization, chess. In the highlands are those that are in theory or to date more difficult tasks for a computer to perform. So things like social interaction, writing books, performing science. But you'll also see that the visual or the conceptual model has a watermark. And that watermark is essentially the advancing flood of computer performance. And so you'll see on here that arithmetic is under the watermark. So 75 years ago, computers began to flood the lowlands, which covered up the skills of arithmetic. And so in this frame, we think about tasks that are easy and challenging for computers to perform, and then map different competencies to that. The second frame of thinking that we wanted to share is on the next slide, and it is called the risk of replacement model. And so this was put forward by Kai-Fu Lee, the former president of Google's China office. And this is actually one of two versions of this, this is his cognitive labor matrix. But essentially, Kai-Fu Lee argues that traditional classifications that distinguish high-skilled and low-skilled jobs are not well equipped to help us assess the potential impact of AI on job replacement. So what he does is map jobs along two dimensions. Dimension one, the degree to which they rely on social skills for success. And then two, the degree to which they rely on creative or strategic thinking. So jobs that are highly social and are heavily based in creativity and strategy, such as the role of a CEO, are situated in the top right-hand quadrant, which he calls the safe zone. Jobs that are highly asocial and can also be optimized through rules and logic, such as a personal tax assistant, sit within the danger zone. So those that are at very high risk of being replaced by AI. We have a third quadrant called the human veneer quadrant, which might initially appear to be in the safe zone because of a heavy reliance on social skills. But underlying these jobs is the requirement that they really succeed based on the degree to which they can be optimized through the application of rules and logic. So financial planners, for example, are an example of a job that would sit within the human veneer. And in the last quadrant, the slow creep zone, we see jobs that are relatively asocial, but also rely heavily on creativity and strategy. For example, the work of an artist or the work of a scientist. And so roles in the slow creep zone have potential to be replaced by AI, but would argue that it's unlikely to occur in the immediate future. So what the article in NDE does is to map both of these to evaluation competencies. And I won't go through these in great detail, but if we skip to the next slide, you'll see an image of a potential mapping of the landscape of evaluator competencies, which is my attempt to map my understanding of where evaluator competencies might sit using the landscape that of highlands, lowlands, and the watermark, using what we know about other existing tools to perform these tasks. Are there similar tasks? Where are similar tasks placed in the landscape of human competencies? And then is there existing research that looks at how easy or difficult it is for computers to perform this task? And then so in the attempt at mapping these, essentially it was things like facilitating decision-making, fostering positive relationships, managing conflicts, and building trust throughout the evaluation. So those things that sit within the interpersonal domain of the evaluator competencies that it would seem like are more likely to be in the highlands. And then on the last slide, we have a mapping of the competency domains across those two dimensions in the risk of replacement model. Again, coming to the conclusion or the argument that domains that relate to context and interpersonal skills are probably those that might be in the safe zone because they rely on a high degree of social engagement and are heavily creativity or strategy based. And so I guess all of this coming to the conclusion that what we as evaluators might do is to seek out those parts of evaluation that do involve people, unpredictability, creativity, and strategy, and focus on those as ways for evaluators to embrace alongside AI. Bianca, it is all yours.
All right. So this will be the last sort of content piece before we put some resources in front of you, because we suspect many of you are trying to navigate this. So I will be very frank, I am very excited about AI, but I'm also trying to be really responsible about how I approach it and how I think about using it in evaluation. And I had been trying to think about a way to make sense and help me sort of navigate some of this, particularly in using AI in my evaluation work, my evaluation practice. And so the question I kept coming back to is, understanding these red flags and, some of which we've talked about, right? How do we responsibly embrace AI while keeping those kinds of things in mind? One way that I think is useful and that I am finding useful, and which I write about in the NDE article, is to think about what criteria we might use to decide if AI use and evaluation will be or was a good thing. And I talk about why I decided on criteria in the article, but for the sake of time, I'm not gonna get into it. And so, just to make sure we're on the same page, I'm going to put a definition of criteria on the slide for you. But basically, criteria identify and define the aspects on which what we evaluate is judged, right? So, being able to answer a question like, was this a good use of AI in evaluation, requires that we think about what criteria we might use to help answer that question, right? And there's been a lot of really good work in the field, one of which is recent work by Rebecca Teasdale at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She has been working to develop, refine, and field test an integrated model of criteria, domains, and perspectives. And you see that framework on the screen. I would just say that there's sort of two clusters of criteria: those that address conceptualization and implementation, which you see on the right-hand side of your screen, and those that address the results that come out of an evaluation, which you see on the left-hand side of your screen. And so what I did was I used the criteria as a framework, and I read all of the articles in the NDE issue, start to finish, right, with two questions in mind. One, which of Teasdale's criteria show up in these articles? And two, do these articles suggest additional or new criteria that aren't included in Teasdale's framework? And so I'm going to show you those criteria in a second, but let me also caveat this. I think criteria are helpful, and I also think there's still much work to be done in this area. So I'm not claiming, and I don't claim in the article, that these criteria ought to be now mandated or universal. I think we're a long way from there, and I think we have more work to do. Rather, my purpose is much more modest, and that is to illustrate possibilities for how we might think about this and to inspire further debate, dialogue, and critical reflection by all of us in the community. Okay, so total of 8 criteria that I identify across these articles. The first 3 are clustered in the domain that deals with conceptualization and implementation or use of AI in that, right? And so they cluster in design and implementation, efficiency of process, and equity of process. On the far right, you see examples of the kinds of questions each of these criterion bring up, and that I argue in the paper evaluators who are thinking about or who are using AI in their practice ought to be able to answer, right? I'll also say that these questions assume that you are evaluating things after the fact, but they can be slightly reworded to be answerable and for you to think about them before you on the front end before you actually use AI. The remaining 5 criteria are centered on outcomes resulting from the use of AI in an evaluation. They are effectiveness, trust, methodological validity and trustworthiness, understandability, and equity of resulting information. Again, on the far right, you see examples of the kinds of questions that each of these criterion brings up. And like the previous slide, the questions assume a retrospective analysis on these questions, but again, could be slightly reworded to be prospective. I'll also say that I'm not the only one who's been thinking about this idea. So I recently learned about a little known checklist actually developed in 2019 by the Tech Salon. And for those that are unfamiliar, I actually hadn't heard of the Tech Salon before, but it is a forum where technology and development professionals share their opinions on emerging trends. And so in 2019, they hosted a salon devoted to the question, how to evaluate AI use cases for development programs. And the result of that was a document called Artificial Intelligence Evaluation Checklist. Now, full disclosure, not so convinced that what you see on the screen is what I consider to be a set of criteria. I actually think it's a checklist that focuses on AI use, feasibility, and evaluability. I think, in the frames we use in evaluation, I think that's what it is. But even so, it shows that I'm not the only one who's been thinking that evaluation criteria might be useful for thinking about how to navigate all of this in our evaluation practice. So, promised resources. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who's going to share some resources.
And I know that we are a little bit delayed in time, so we'll do this very, very briefly. We will make this slide deck available to you all. And so know that there are a number of resources available to you. If you are an AEA member, you will have access to the full NDE special issue. There is a link to the technology salons checklist that Bianca just showed. Merletech, if you are not familiar with it, is a brilliant resource. The Australian Evaluation Society also held, as part of their Fest Eval in 2024, some presentations on AI and machine learning, which you have access to. And then Stefan Bonnie-Nielsen and colleagues have an open access book that is available to all that we have the link to there. It is an edited book with a whole bunch of different chapters about different ways of thinking about emerging technology and artificial intelligence in evaluation. And so with that, we will stop talking at you and hand it over to everyone to ask questions. If no one has questions, we have a question for you that might be used to prompt discussion. That being, what, in your perspective, what are you most excited about with respect to AI and evaluation? And then what, if anything, are you most wary of?